Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. How are you out there? Come on, let's give this event a round of applause before we even get started. This is powerful, what we are about to begin to do. I thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this important launch. This is a very special day. This is a day where we celebrate the Mayor's Book Club doing what it normally does, and that is lifting the entire community through educating ourselves through literacy. We need to understand that the Mayor's Book Club is always about great literature, but today we want to send a message to the entire city that the Mayor's Book Club is not just about educating children. We believe that education and literacy is a top priority, and we all can be lifted. The beautiful thing about this day is leadership have taken a very particular stance today. And today the stance is simply about saying that we are going to educate ourselves because it's going to help us personally, it's going to help us professionally, mentally, and emotionally. How many people were kind of stressed out from COVID? Can I just get it? All right, so the beautiful thing about the book that we're about to engage in is it deals with trauma and crises. Today we're going to be learning about Resma Minikim, and we are going to take a stance to read My Grandmother's Hands, which is a book about racialized trauma and how it's actually stored in the body. Not only is it talking about race, you know, that topic we're so afraid to talk about, but not only is it talking about race, but it's talking about how race already caused trauma that's stored in your body. And here, he's just giving us tools on how we can actually deal with that trauma. Today, I just want to thank all of the panelists because they represent great leadership. So let's give them a round of applause. But before we do anything, we have some young people from Central High School that's actually going to begin. This is the only JRTC program in the entire city of Newark, and Central High School students are here to get us started. So let's invite the Central High School JRTC so they can engage us with the color guard. So let's give them a round of applause as they come forward. At this time, we're going to invite Reverend Roundtree to come forth to give an invocation because this day is about healing, and so we're going to invite her to the podium to get us started. Let's give a warm round of applause to Reverend Roundtree.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I in here by myself? It's evening. You say evening. It's good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I know that we're dealing with trauma, and the book, My Grandmother's Hands, is a book that's helping us find with the pathway to healing and mending our broken hearts. So in spite of all of that, I'm going to do what I was asked to do. And one of those things is that I know that even though we're in the community, we're celebrating the Mayor's Book Club, my grandma's mother's house, my goodness. Dr. Brown asked me, because I deal with a lot of trauma victims, and I deal with the North Police Department, and I deal with the community, to just have a few words before prayer. Those were the few words. I deal with it, and I'm so thankful that my grandmother's hands, the racialized trauma and the pathway to mending our hearts and bodies, is what we're going to go before the throne of grace and just have a little talk with God about as I invoke God's presence. Dear God, as we invoke your presence in this place for the partnership with the North Police Department and now the Fire Department, as Resma Menicum has put pen to paper to help us with a pathway as we deal with the trauma to our hearts and our bodies for all walks of life. We thank you, God, for this day that we have all come together. Fill us with your mercy that we may in turn be merciful to others. Strip away pride and racism so that we may have peace in our communities. Strengthen our hearts so they may beat only to the rhythm of humanity and not beating to racial trauma and equality. Dear God, as we come together this afternoon, we know your presence is already in this place. So help us to be better at what we do. Help us to care more than we do. Help us to love on one another more than we do. And most of all, move on the hearts and the minds of those who are mistreating and doing injustice to others. We are healing, and that's what we're here to help each other do. So God, we can't do it without your presence. We can't do it without your help. So continue to be in us to strengthen us that we might carry out your will. I pray this prayer in the name of some who call you Jesus, some call you Allah, some call you Yahweh, some call you Elohim, but you're our God and our Creator. So we thank you for all the partners that have come together for this day that you have made. Amen, Amen, and Ashe.
Okay, we're going to get started soon, but just two more things. First, we would just like to talk about RESMA just a little bit. RESMA's purpose is to get us to read, and we are not coming here today as experts. We're coming here because the leadership that's on this panel have said yes to the particular work in equitable leadership. The definition for equitable and inclusive leadership is really about giving the community or giving the people that you serve what they need, when they need it, and where they need it. And one of the things that needs to be understood in order to give the community what they need is to understand. Equity is a little step further than diversity. It's important to make sure that our institutions are diverse, that they have the quantifiable numbers, and they are consistent with what our community looks like. So that's diversity. Equitable leadership is about does all individuals, can they prosper and be successful in your institution? Are all individuals' needs met? Equity work is about understanding those historical legacies of trauma or barriers that may not allow people to be successful. Today, we're going to engage in that equity work, and reading RESMA book is about doing the equity work so we can become a more inclusive society. And I just want to thank the distinguished panel for being here. I want to first give it up for our mayor, this is his book club, and so this is one of the books that he selected. Let's give it up for the mayor of this great city, Mayor Raz Baraka. And then I want to give us a hearty round of applause to our Public Safety Director, O'Hara. We want to thank him for representing the Police Division. I want to also give a round of applause to our Fire Chief, who said, hey, if the Police Division is doing that good work, so will the Fire Division. Let's give it up for Fire Chief Jackson. Thank you so much. And last, but definitely, I'm sorry, it's not last, I'm sorry. Our director, Lakeisha Uri. Before you clap, I just want to talk about this important addition to the police division. You are engaging in that work by leading the social workers, so as we police, that we have the heart. So I thank you for being the heart of the police division by representing our social workers. The OVPTR director, Lakeisha Uri. Let's give her a round of applause. And I also want to give a warm welcome to Assistant Public Director, Reverend Slaughter. His work is also what I'm also going to invite a spiritual aspect in it. I apologize because he is our Reverend Slaughter. So let's give him a round of applause. And so I'm just going to get out of the way so we can actually start the program. And again, be prepared, because after the panel discussion, we're going to invite you to have some questions, and then we're going to celebrate by breaking bread together. So I just want you to sit back and relax and enjoy the discussion around My Grandmother's Hands, and welcome to the launch. We haven't done the reading yet, but we're committed to the reading, and that's what this public stance is about today. So enjoy the program and get ready and write down your questions as you are experiencing it. Mr. Mayor Rasbaraka, it's in your hands.
Good afternoon. We usually do this with kids, so they probably a little bit more obedient, let me just say that. They probably actually, these kids actually read the material, so when we do our book club, they, not only do they read the material, they really read the material. They finish the books. They're very engaged, and we've been all over the city. We haven't discussed My Grandma's Hands yet, but we're reading a book called Warmth of Other Suns, and it's a lot thicker than that one. So it's been great. But this book here, My Grandma's Hands, is incredibly important. I don't know if you guys, I see some of you got little notes, and so you started reading it. I don't know if people out there have begun reading it, but you should, because it is instructive. Not only gives us information, but also tells us some specific practices to engage in that helps us deal directly with trauma that we've experienced. And I know some of you are tough and you don't have trauma, but the book kind of points out that all of us have been experienced some form of trauma at one point or another, and more importantly, historical trauma. And that's basically what we need to get into, the kind of historical trauma that all of us have experienced, and that it has a physical effect on us. So what do you hope happens as a result of reading this book, folks on the panel? What do you hope happens as a result of reading this? Anybody could jump in. So I guess, talking about this stuff, particularly at this point, is important. Everybody has experienced things that we never experienced before in our lives over the last 2 years have been incredibly difficult, but especially for police officers, I think. I know, like, even before COVID, when we first started, the trauma to trust training with community in the room. I know some of the officers here went through that. I think officers learned from that experience that trauma and having kind of those difficult conversations, trauma is the common bridge that police officers in particular have with a lot of people in the community. Just because police officers and community gets to see that police officers experience trauma in their work just by seeing a lot of things repeatedly over and over and over again, that's just not normal. Anybody could jump in.
Our hope is an eye-opening encounter, one that helps us to all realize that we have encountered trauma in some way, in some shape, form, or fashion, whether it's acute trauma, whether it's chronic or complex. I was teasing the mayor earlier that I would probably categorize my upbringing to be traumatic in a sense, because in the old school way of raising a child, the discipline is quite different than what it is today. And reading this material helps me as a parent, I'm speaking as a parent now, not to perpetuate trauma in the life of my own child through some form of discipline, because children today are just wired differently. I don't think they could take, I'm not going to call it abuse or the type of rearing that I was subjected to, but it worked out well. I had no idea, Mayor, that was trauma. Right. I just thought it was discipline. But discipline ended up carrying over into trauma in so many forms. And then also the colorization and how we have to be cognizant of that and how trauma affects the way we see people, the way we perceive one another. So I hope it really is enlightening because it is an encounter that all of us need to have. And Rasmus has done a good job in that.
Yes, yes.
From my perspective with fire, with the fire department, me coming on the job, young, and being able to work with a diverse number of people initially when I came on, and just being open to it, born and raised here in Newark, and never had, fire service being one of my first jobs, and then for me to work in this department and work with numerous people and learn lessons on not only the job but on life from different nationalities, different makes, different backgrounds. And in the fire service, it's kind of difficult for me to get others to do the same and learn from each other, which I think we would grow in life. And in the book, I just started the book, but I'm hooked on it. But in the first chapter, Resnick spoke about clean pain. And clean pain, I would consider it would be me working in different areas, or anybody working in different areas with different people. And then he spoke about dirty pain, where I have firefighters sometimes that don't want to work with others or don't want to work in other stations. So my goal is to get through this book and to hopefully learn more about myself, about our nationality, about all nationalities, and to be able to, I guess, portray and promote the knowledge and the experiences that are being brought out in this book. I think it's very important, and this book is touching, that we all are having trauma, all nationalities, black, white, Hispanic, male, female, we all are having trauma. So this is an excellent way of expressing this to us all, and hoping that we all take the knowledge and better ourselves. Thanks.
So for me, for this book, and being in the field, and most of us in here are all first responders, right? We're all fire, law enforcement, social workers, even residents, and being first responders, this all gives us a point of reference. And so if we all read the book and we all know some of the things that it teaches us, then when we're out there together, working together, we can say certain words and we'll all kind of have that point of reference to help us be able to move the work along. It helps us to shift the culture. That's what I'm hoping happens, right? We're already in the process of shifting culture here in the city, but I'm hoping that it helps us to do it better, because when it's us and when it's on you, it's a bit harder to do it, but when it's someone else and it's in a book and it's a little bit more abstract, then the relatability, may be a bit different. In which case, I want us to be able to relate, have some relatable experiences, because we know that trauma is different, as O'Hara said, with the trauma to trust. When we're in a room together, most people don't see that law enforcement go from job to job to job to job. They see shootings, robbings, stabbings, robberies, different things, and then there's no healing, right? There's no talk about, you just keep working, you just keep going. In social work, we see client after client, mental health, all of those things, you just keep going. And so this book helps us to see the humanity. It helps us to be able to relate. It helps us to have a point of reference, and it helps us to be able to be accountable to shift the culture in our city around trauma.
So more, I'm about to say, can you hold the applause till we over to Dr. Brown over there? But at the end of the day, one thing that I think that we should really focus on in this small period of time of our conversation that we have, as well as just where the trauma comes from, and being able to identify the why in it helps us understand where people are. The title of My Grandmother's Hands, right? Obviously, about a woman who picked cotton all of her life, and her hands became hardened because of the cotton was actually difficult to pick. People don't know that. Obviously, most of us have never picked cotton. So unless we lived in the South and was part of a sharecropping family, I still know people who actually picked cotton. It actually pricks your fingers when you pick it. So her hands were hard, and the hardening of her hands is a result of her picking cotton. So her experience, her physical experience, obviously has some emotional experiences attached to it, but it has some physical damage as well to her hand, and that is kind of synonymous to what we're talking about, like the historical things that have happened have hardened us in a specific kind of way, one way or the other. Can you talk about how that's relevant? I mean, everybody don't have to speak every time, but if you feel like you want to say something about the points that I'm raising, please, if you feel passionate about that. Something about, how we are now as a result of our historical trauma. And in the book, she divides African Americans' historical trauma from people who came as immigrants from Europe, right? And people in the trauma they experienced, and the trauma that was experienced by police officers, and how all these traumatic people come together and we see explosion. Anybody want to speak on that? Not all at once. I'm going to act like the teacher here. Just pick your hand. These guys first.
Well, I guess
Okay, I got you. Go ahead.
when you look at it from a historical perspective, the worst form of slavery practiced in any country was chattel slavery. And chattel slavery was more specifically practiced in the United States of America more than any other country. It involved what we know as desexualization, derationalization, dehumanization. The basic principle of chattel slavery, I think Dr. Orlando Patterson, who is a historical and sociologist, I think he puts it in the best possible words. It was a social death. It was intended to destroy the slave to the core. So much so that they didn't think much of themselves, didn't think much of anyone. And when you look at history, and the history of this country, not only then, but even through the civil rights. Most times, Mayor, we don't even talk about the civil rights of 1866, which was about the 90% illiteracy rate in the country at that time. We only remember the civil rights that Dr. King led. But over and over in this country, it seems like people of color in particular had to fight for every single thing that they received. And it carries over. After you read that over and over again, and it's ingrained, and you study it, you build up resentment. It does harden you to the core, even from a spiritual perspective. And that's why many preachers, not all of them, but many preachers end up becoming activists, because they have studied the history, they have seen it throughout their lifetime, and the trauma that comes from it. When we talk about this book in particular, trauma from the womb, you know, and it being passed down, genetically, it hardens you, and it causes you to get angry and frustrated when you're seeing things over and over again, and when you see it perpetuated from a law enforcement perspective, you become even more angry. I've seen a pendulum shift in my own life in 1 year in this position that the mayor appointed me and Director O'Hara consented, because in the church we call it apologetics. That's when you defend Christianity, you defend the church, the doctrine and the principles of it. And now that I'm on this side of law enforcement, I find myself more defending law enforcement, the good of it, not the bad. But for persons that have experienced trauma at the hands of law enforcement who have been hardened, they see me as a turncoat, you know, as someone that has went from one side to the other. But I have to make it clear I'm not defending bad practices. And so when we encountering persons of color, it seems like they're angry, it seems like they're mad, and it could be, but they've experienced so much trauma and have seen it with their very own eyes in their community that they have been hardened. And so some of that is the origins of it as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna let the chief say something, but before I wanna just ask you a question, Keisha, about something that the Reverend Slaughter touched on in terms of the trauma. Just speak a little bit about the genetic, you know, because people don't understand that trauma is genetic, it's complex and chronic, right? That it is in the womb, you know, babies experience trauma based on the trauma that their mother is experiencing at the time. And just the physical, when Reverend Slaughter was talking about the way he is thinking about disciplining his children, in The Warmth of Other Sons, and the kids talk about this part of it a lot. In The Warmth of Other Sons, they was discussing how African American parents in the South beat their children to a point where they were beating them to replace how they would be beaten if they got caught, right? So I'm gonna beat you so you experience what it feels like to be beaten by somebody. If you do X, Y, and Z, I'm gonna beat you. And that beating to them was like a form of like, I'm protecting you. I'm gonna beat you like I'm gonna kill you before somebody else kill you. You know, that kind of thing, which results in a trauma response. So you can talk about that just a little bit, and I'm gonna let the chief say something.
The mayor talked about it, and so when we, learn about trauma, there's three main types, right? We have acute, which is a single incident, something just happens the one time. Then we have chronic, which is repeated, prolonged, such as domestic violence or abuse. And then we have complex, when you're constantly exposed. But we also have trauma where it's vicarious, right? Where you don't have to have experienced it, but you saw it, you were around, and so you are still affected by it. And when we have these different types of trauma, we have individual trauma, collective trauma, where we experience it together, generational trauma, historical trauma, and as he just talked about, the genetic. And when we have the genetic trauma, it is passed down. There's a study, and I don't know the name of it, where they show with the mice, and they show how when they reproduce, you can see that the trauma is handed down when the mice are in like the wheel and they're learning. And it teaches you based on trauma responses. And so when you constantly are nervous, you have anxiety, you're stressed, and it can be passed down in the womb. And they show how generation to generation to generation that's passed down. So if we're talking about slavery for 500 years, then we have generation that's experiencing that, and they're taught how to behave. They're taught how not to get hurt, how not to get beat, how not to get sold off, how not to get, all of those things, chastised. And so those things are handed down to where we even see it today, right? Where we see, if we're in a grocery store, we joke about it, right? And white kids get to run around the store, jump, play, get to do everything and be free, but our Black and Latino families are saying, don't touch anything, don't ask for anything, you get a whole lesson before you even get in the store, right? But they don't get those conversations. They don't get to have, because they don't have to look at being embarrassed, right? They don't have to get to look at if law enforcement, if they're going to be accused of stealing, if they're going to be followed in the store, or, you know, all of those things that come along with just being who you are. Racial trauma, right? Just being who you are just racially, right? Biologically. And some of those it don't come along with it. And so you become resentful that they get to do that and we don't. They get to have things and we don't. They get to go places and we don't, because we are functions a lot of times out of poverty, out of whatever those things are, right? And those traumatic experiences create trauma responses where it's handed down, and we see it from generation to generation, even how we rear our children and how we relate to our friends in the neighborhoods that we live in, and it becomes a culture. And so that's part of your question in terms of what that looks like.
Yeah, and it is traumatic. You know, I catch myself, you know, after reading the book and talking to you guys about it, you know, catch myself with my son, you know, he playing and running around, and, you know, I'll be wanting to grab him up like, come here. But I let him, you know, explore and experiment and do the stuff that other children get to do. Yeah. Yeah, No, he don't get to write on the refrigerator, no. He can't write on the refrigerator. But Chief, go ahead.
He talked about passing down trauma, and it dawned on me reading the first 2 chapters, because that's as far as I got. I just got the book, and it makes you wonder why some things give you anxiety, some things make you scared, and I never realized why it was passed down from me, something that was generations, maybe last generation, or this generation, and there are events that, you know, that make a difference. I was in Costco one day, and I handed my receipt to the woman, and she took forever to give it back to me. She's checking and she's double checking, and I sat there, and it made me upset because the next few people was like fast. So you know, so everything affects you, and sometimes you don't know where it comes from, and it's good to, you know, to find out why. You might have inherited some of it. So.
I'm gonna let you. I know you wanted to say something. Let you say something. Go ahead.
I was just basically, I'm very glad that this conversation is coming up. It seems to be evolutionary in terms of understanding that our bodies are the receptors and they have their own intelligence. And how we choose to, how we survive. It's amazing the fact that we as an ethnic group is so resilient based on the inhumanity we've had to survive. And the fact that we are not allowed to be angry about it. Anger is a secondary emotion to shame and pain. So I'm very happy, you know, to see that this conversation is coming about, particularly with Black folks, and how we address each other, how we feel about ourselves, and how to deal with the microaggressions of other groups and our own group in terms of surviving this systemic dysfunction.
Right.
If I could just quickly piggyback off of what the chief was saying. Like, I realized along the way how, as a race, we're embarrassed when our people do anything else.
Right.
Even though we're not there. We probably don't have to be in the same state. When a shooting happened, the first thing, what do we think? We hope it's not a Black person. Yeah. Because we're embarrassed by things, because we think we're judged on what other people do just because we're the same. Yeah. And that's something we will learn, that we have to walk a straight line. And we kind of frown upon when they do anything beyond that line because we expect to be judged on that.
Right, 100%. You know, trauma is actually a defense mechanism, so it's normal, and stress is also normal. It is designed to keep you alive in crisis and critical situations. That's where stress comes from. It's designed to keep you alive, but when you become overstressed, and stress actually produces a physical response and a chemical response as well. And it's designed so you survive like any other species during a specific period of time. The problem is we have a lot of it, and it guides what we think and say and how we see a thing. So just, moving, as to point of change, right? So healing and staying the same both causes discomfort, right? So all of it causes discomfort. Anyway, that's painful. You either decide to live with the pain or you decide to change, and the change is going to cause pain itself, right? So what do we do to cope with the pain that's going to be caused? And so what it's saying is that pain is inevitable. Yeah. How do we choose which one we want, and how do we cope with that? Hopefully we choose and change, but it's not always the case.
I think it's like some injuries that you get. Sometimes, depending, like you break a bone in a certain place or whatever, in order for the healing process to start, it's gonna get more painful first. And I think that's kind of like what this is. Like in order to actually start the healing process, like you have to acknowledge and be willing to get a little bit more uncomfortable first before things start healing and get better.
Yeah. Anybody else? Sometimes when it's painful though, don't people stop? Yeah. Won't it force you to stop? Because especially if you've learned to live with the pain you already have.
Choose a coping mechanism, something that gets you through the pain. That's a lot of problems too. Yep.
So what you experience is when you are afraid or you have anxiety or something is too hard, one of the trauma responses is, they call it fight, flight, or freeze, right? So you either stop, like the mayor said, you run. Most of us are runners, right? We'll avoid it, or we're fighters. And a lot of times what people see is that fight in a lot of us who are a bit more boisterous, who speak up, who stand their ground, or those things. And so those are the responses that you'll see: fight, flight, or freeze.
So I'm gonna take us a little deeper before I open it up. So all of this stuff that's happening around the country right now, the police shootings, all of this stuff that's happening everywhere. How is this adding to the trauma that exists now, and what have been the responses to that? Traumatic responses to that?
I think it's, for a lot of people, like even if there's just one incident out of 1 million or out of 1 billion, it's just confirming what people already feel is the case already and what they experience already. I mean, it's to me, a lot of times just adding to the problem.
Well, what is the physical kind of and emotional response is what I'm trying to get at, that's happening to people at this time? In the police department, in the community, what is the...
Violence.
It's violence.
Violence.
What do you mean by that?
You have an increase in violence, not just our shootings, right? Shootings, stabbings, robberies, all of those things. You have an increase in domestic violence, sexual violence, political violence, social violence, financial violence. And so that's what we see. We see a huge increase, a huge spike, in all of us trying to figure out what to do. And so because it's so much, we have to find the answers here. Let's have that conversation.
But what about the police department?
It's had real effects on every police department in this country. People are leaving like crazy. They're leaving the profession. We cannot get people to come in, to actually join, to actually try and be a part of the change. I think I read something the other day, of the 56 largest police departments in the country, I think 48 have changed the executive at least once since COVID, since all this stuff started.
Yes.
With law enforcement, I believe that we carry the burden of others. When someone makes a mistake, I'm wearing a uniform just like they are. So let's say, for instance, she had a rough day and something went wrong with her. If I occupy that same block, excuse me, I would carry that burden walking the same street.
Yeah. What are some of the things in the book that they talk about that we can do though to help us get through this, besides going to the bar?
I think they mentioned the bar.
Yeah, I don't think the bar is on the list. But I mean, what are some things? Yeah.
I think it talks.
Yeah.
I think when we're talking about changing this and getting through this is the positive community interaction that we're seeing in Newark and we're not seeing in many other places. Of course, I have a front view of it, unlike most, to see the change that is occurring right in Newark public safety from the community aspect and the community involvement. And I think in the book it talks about the police body senses that all bodies needs its protection.
Right.
However, it sees black bodies as often dangerous and disruptive. That's something that Newark, it's changing that whole conversation. Director O'Hara and I were on a conversation with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., talking about the role of police in the Holocaust, or in all civil rights matters. And of course, we know it has a negative connotation in a sense in America when we look at Alabama and what took place with Congressman John Lewis and the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and we see the police involvement. And so we're trying to change that narrative. But one of the things that came out of that conversation was former Director or Chief Ramsey, who we most times see on CNN and all of these, that was the Chief of Police in Washington, D.C., and then the Chief of Police in Philadelphia. And the narrative he was trying to change is that law enforcement has to no longer see itself as enforcing the laws of the city or the laws of the land. But law enforcement must now see themselves as protecting the rights of every individual that they are given authority over or charge of in that city or state. So when you change the peripheral view and you're no longer just enforcing laws, but now you're in the business of protecting the rights of every individual, it changes the color line. It changes the way you look at individuals, because whether they're black, whether they're white, whether they're Hispanic, you're to protect the rights of all of those particular individuals, which will change the way you police when you look at it from that perspective. And I'll stop there because there's so many more.
This concept of fear, because usually when I have conversations with like older kind of police officers, every time something happens, they always say that fear is what made this officer do that. They're afraid. But fear is also a learned response. It becomes a traumatic response, as you pointed out in the book. But why are you afraid of this person as opposed to that person? And at the basis of that fear might be a little racism, or learned prejudice that's learned, and it's a reaction. It's traumatic to see images of black people beating and killing people. And then you're in a situation and you're seeing black and brown people in these instances all of the time, it becomes internalized to you that when you see them, that's what they're going to do. That's right. Right? Even if you're not directly there, you're seeing it on TV, you're seeing it in the movies, you're seeing so you automatically get this kind of feeling, which is natural, a kind of the spidey sense that comes on because this person is dangerous. Like, that you might not get in the same situation. Because look, I grew up in Newark. There are places that I could go in the city that I don't feel afraid and other people do. And I don't feel afraid because I'm a tough guy. I don't feel afraid because it's normal to me, right? It's normal. That's why I don't feel afraid. Not every 5 minutes I'm not like, danger, danger, danger. You know what I mean? I'm like, I can talk because I've been in situations where I had to talk, right? So, anybody want to add to that?
The only thing I would add is it makes me think of the Chief Justice in the 50s, he argued Brown versus Board of Ed. And one of the things that was used was a study that was conducted like in the 50s. And it just showed that a young African-American, like elementary school age child, and they showed him like different things, like which thing is good, which thing is bad, that kind of thing.
The doll study.
Yes, the doll study. And like repeatedly, like even the African-American kids had like a bias towards, like the white doll is good, the black doll is bad. And it's just it's like learned bias almost, and it affects all of us.
But even deeper than bias is a traumatic response, right? So it's a way people are thinking about things to protect themselves, which means that it's going to take a lot of work to undo, right? The last question, I want to open it up to the audience because we're running out of time. Just this, idea of trying to address all of this. First of all, do we think we're wasting our time? And I think the fire department is involved in this, it should be involved in as well. So I'm glad the chief thought it not robbery to participate in this conversation. I think everybody really should have these kind of discussions, no matter what your profession is. The point is, like, are we wasting our time? And this equity work that we're trying to do, people look at it as like this social justice thing, but really what we're trying to do is humanize people who have been dehumanized. Yeah. Right. And that's really what's happening here. We're really trying to humanize people that have been dehumanized. And so we have this kind of discussion about our own humanity, because that's what I got from the book. Like, it made me look at my own humanity, my own practices with my own children, and how I deal with my own, how do I cope with the stress and the issues that I have? Because my own traumatic issues and stress, how am I handling that? And is it affecting the decisions that I make every day? The decisions I make politically, the decisions I make personally, is it affecting that? Like, and when I think about it, I think that this is a lot of stuff. Like, are we wasting our time here? And do you think that this is important work? And, how do we begin to march down this road?
I think we're marching down the road by having the discussion. Yes. This whole trauma reminds me of, especially this book, of when we started talking about mental health in the Black community. It had such a negative connotation at one time. People said, oh, if you go see the therapist, that means you're crazy, And I oftentimes said in the church, no, I don't mean I'm crazy. I'm trying to keep from going crazy. And so there's somebody that God has provided as a vehicle to help me to navigate this stuff that's going on in my mind. And so I think starting the discussion and discussing it more in communities of color where we normally won't talk about these things will help us get to the equity, but also talking about it in communities that have dehumanized people for so long, to help them to see the human side of every individual. So this is worthwhile, and I believe just starting it with this book club, this book tour, asking departments to read it. I believe the Genesis can cause us, and of course I'm spiritual, so I'm gonna go from Genesis to Revelation, so I'm gonna drop the mic, but it'll help us to traverse and to navigate this difficult road of trauma, because as the mayor said, my 10-year-old son, I'm around cops, his uncle is a federal agent for 20 years, but when he sees an officer, he goes, for whatever reason, whether it's movies or what he's watching on TV or the shootings that have occurred of young Black boys, he goes into almost a traumatic, shaking episode, to the point that I have to get help for that, to realize they're not against you. They're not coming for you. And so Mayor remembers, one of the reasons I took this job is to help my son to realize that, no, your family is involved in this. They all are not bad. They're here for you. So I believe starting the discussion is necessary, but not allowing the flame to go out. We must continue sustainability. We must continue to have this discussion.
I think it's very important for us to not only have the discussion, because on here we talk about being trauma informed. And so for me and with my team, I tell them that it's not enough to be trauma informed. After you know, then what? Then you're responsible for it. So then we have to be trauma engaged. And most of us that's in this work is engaged already, but now we have to activate. and that we have to activate something in the people around us. And so we're going from being trauma-informed to trauma-engaged to now trauma-activated. And when you see activation, then it speaks for itself. And so that's the direction that I certainly want to see us going in, and that we can see it at every stage that we're in.
The mayor referenced, like, is this a waste of time? And the police are here, so I'm going to speak about the police. I think this obviously makes us all safer in the long run. And I say that because, I think the results of everything that we've been trying to do and everything that was happening was probably most evident that last weekend in May outside the 1st Precinct. Because if something like that had happened even just a few years before, it would have been a dramatically different situation.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of everything, Mayor. The way that we're policing now, the way that we're more community involved. I think what we say is what? You read, you say it, and you do it. And the police officers here, the men and women here, have definitely made a dramatic change in the way that we're policing, and it's showing. Although the numbers are numbers, but me living here, born, raised here, and as a kid growing up here in Newark, I've experienced where policing was a lot different. Where you were stereotyped, you were treated unfairly for no particular reasons. And I'm a son of a police officer, but I think what we're doing here, what the leaders of the city is doing, all right, and having book clubs like this so that we can read about it, so we can continue to do it, and we can continue to teach and saying it to people respectfully and educationally what the truth is, and get it out the way and move forward and grow from it. I think this is excellent, and I look forward to participating more.
Yep, I want to open it up to the floor. We got 1, 2, and I want us to, when we read this book, to go deeper than the surface, because some of us will be playing around on the surface for a long time, and we'll never get to the meat of it, and it'll stop us from really getting the response that we need to get out of it. Yes, ma'am.
I am a Lincoln Park Post-Cultural District resident, and I attend a meeting once a month, the end of the month. It's the last Wednesday in the month. So we just had a meeting on Wednesday. It was a very innovative, very informative meeting. And what I'm concerned about is when we are dealing with all of this emotional stuff, there are triggers. We all trigger each other. How can we develop some sort of structure around protection and safety when these triggers happen? Because that happened to me in the meeting. I just expressed something, and it was a social worker who became very defensive with me. And I had to come back and, express that we are talking about, I'm not complaining about the lack of support from the police department. I am saying that seeing people, 2 of the members on the team were teachers, performing arts school, talking about children, witnessing people who are naked, who are mentally ill, walking down the street, seeing people shoot up. Last summer was rife with that. So I think what I'm saying with this is, with all of this unearthing of all this emotion, we need to have a place where there is a safety so that triggers are going to come up. How do we, so this is more a sustainable model, not a reactive model.
And the good thing about the book too, it gives us kind of instructive things to do. It's not just a book that's talking about trauma. It gives us in each part of the book things to do to deal with your trauma. So it's just not saying, oh, you traumatized. That's what makes the book that much better, is instructive. But we do need, as Director Yuri talks about, some healing centers in the city where people could stop in and pause for a second, especially with all this stuff going on, or at least safe places, to be able to do that. But I think the stuff in the book, we should begin to practice it. We should practice it.
And it's not going to happen overnight.
No, ma'am.
It's a process.
Definitely.
It's a real
No,
process.
Yep.
It's a life process.
That's right. Go ahead. Yep.
So definitely thank you for an opportunity to be able to. I agree that these sessions are necessary, but I also feel like on a baseline, I think that if we kind of all need to approach it with the same agenda. Like, what is our end goal as the community, as the police officers? Are we on the same page? Are we trying to arrive at the same end goal? And if that is the case, then a lot of those steps that we're taking to, like how the book does, force us to self-reflect and look at who we are and, our own accountability. That's important to measure, to really kind of see where we are so that we can arrive at the same place without having to point fingers, if you will. Let's start with ourselves and kind of look and see where it is that we need to be better. And the deputy director earlier spoke in reference to law enforcement and protecting the public. A lot of law, to enforce the law, to protect the public, we have to enforce the law. Right. And I think that, yes, definitely there has been some trauma. I personally have experienced trauma in policing, being African American and being a police officer. Yeah. So with that in mind, I feel like if the public also should be aware of what we do as police officers, what is and what isn't lawful. We talk about reasonable articulable suspicion. That is a hunch that might get us to what could be going on as far as a crime being committed. Can that go in a way that probably it should not be? Can that lead down a road where it should not? Absolutely. But oftentimes, real, true, effective law enforcement does start from some type of suspicion that something is going on. Right. That may not be, due to something negative or malicious or racist. It's just kind of the basis of where we get started. And I think that it's important for people to kind of know that.
Yep, and the reason why there's the miscommunication is the different historical levels of trauma that people experienced. And I think that's what the book is trying to point out. When we reach each other in the same space, because we have different levels of historical trauma, our view of the same incident will be different, and most of it will be wrong, right? And that's what we have to understand. Like, people can be suspicious to individuals because of trauma that they went through, right? A woman who's been beaten by a man over and over and over again, a child that witnesses that consistently, are suspicious of men coming in their house doing X, Y, and Z. They're already suspicious. Right. If I've been raped as a child by men in my house, and I talk about that in my house constantly, not only is this creating suspicion for me, for men, but it's going to create suspicion for my children as they grow up in that environment, for men as they get older, if it's not dealt with properly, right? My view of you, while you might not think, well, I'm not being racist, but it might be built on a racist sentiment that you use because of things that you've learned to help you protect yourself from what you think is danger, or period, like all of those things. And when I witnessed my father beat by the police in New York City at 10 years old, right? I mean, beat, and my mother. And I had an encounter with the police in the 5th Precinct when I was a kid, right? Trying to protect my little brother. I was beaten and thrown in jail, so forth, and went through all of this kind of stuff there. So initially as a kid growing up, my response to police is a lot different than it was now, because it's knee-jerk. It's a knee-jerk response. It's a knee-jerk response that you learn. It's in your blood, in your body, and your synapses as your brain is formed, right? So you experience that. When you see them, the tension is there. Like, you feel tense, like something getting ready to go down and I need to protect myself. So if a cop talks to me, or I'm gonna get defensive. If they touch me, I'm gonna go off. Why? Because I think that I'm about to be beat. You touch me? What you touching me for, man? Get off me. I mean, that's how it begins to happen that way. And I think it's different when we learn this stuff. So now when you approach that situation and you see people responding that way, you know how to de-escalate that situation as opposed to escalating it into something that may not need it to happen because of an incident that you had absolutely nothing to do with. You wasn't there 15, none of you was there 20 years ago. You wasn't there. You didn't beat my father. I don't know you. You don't know me. But that emotional and chemical response is making me respond a certain way. And as doctors are able to identify that, so should we be able to identify it and be like, hold up, bro, it's not that serious, but at the end of the day, I think that's what the book is designed to do. And I think hopefully we get to a point where we're able to deal with the humanity that we have in each other, like to see the humanity in each other. Past all of the other things that people gave to us, because people gave us a lot of stuff that we're not really responsible for. We carrying it with us, and so we have to figure out how to compartmentalize, put that to the side, and let me deal with this as myself. So, anybody else got any questions or comments from the audience about the book? Hopefully, does everybody have the book? Hopefully you have access to it, and we're not just doing window dressing. We want you to read it. Like, we actually want you to read it, like, more than once. And Audible got this dope thing, you could buy the book and you can just listen to it. When I do my book clubs, I cheat and tell the kids that all the time. Like, I tell the kids, look, listen to the book. And they be like, yeah, I listen to it. It's a lot faster. You can work out, you can do all the other kind of thing and listen to the book at the same time. So I want people to really actually read my grandmother's hands. Yes, ma'am.
In addition, because the author got the idea about looking at the body,
right,
from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book,
Between the
World and Me, and he talks about the black body and how we do not own our bodies. At least that's the perception overall. And how do we regain our own humanity and stand up for ourselves? So I think in addition to this book, I would suggest that book as well.
We definitely need to get on it. And so I don't want people to think the book is just about us humanizing, talking to people who have dehumanized us, but we've dehumanized ourselves. It's also about identifying your own humanity and discovering your own vulnerability at the same time.
The author also says in the book, it's a way of opening up your neuromuscular pathways so that you have the flow can come back. And I can identify with that through idiokinesis as a dancer. So you open up new neuromuscular pathways when you identify. When I started reading the book, I immediately pulled back from my disdain for the Caucasian practice in this country, or the white supremacy body. And I understood based on, I understand there is, as much as I understood it intellectually from the Crusades, how England went into and demonized the Middle East because they had no resources. It's always, it's about historical knowledge as well. And so I think it's very important that we give ourselves a break, and we practice yoga, we do a lot of other things to ease our nervous systems, because that's what we're dealing with, our nervous systems having to react, respond, or to, find some sort of grace. So I think this is an opening in order for people to have an opportunity to receive grace. As I said, it's not going to come overnight, but it's good pain. You sit in it long enough and you can find a way, and to share with others, because it's also about how you regard others as you grow in the emotional understanding.
I like that, the opportunity to receive grace. And hopefully that's really what I think the end goal should be. to give people the opportunity to receive grace. That's really the point of it. Like you give people grace, the same grace you ask for, all the time. You're willing to give it to other people, and you're only willing to give people grace if you can identify their humanity. If you see that they're human and they err and they fall and they victimize just like you, then you give the opportunity to give people grace, to pause for a second and try to understand where they're coming from. Right, so I like that. So hopefully everybody is, because I have to go do Facebook Live. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I just feel like once we acknowledge our own trauma, that we can really experience someone else's trauma in reference to when we pull someone over, stop someone, and once we realize that, it will be a better situation for all of us.
Sure.
And that's the whole issue. I'm more compassionate of my own trauma. I was homeless, so I can be relatable and compassionate with the homeless.
Right.
And so I was in the shelter. I used to live in the shelter, so I'm more compassionate about somebody being in the shelter. So when you have that more experience as a child with someone, and then you transform yourself into a police officer, that is more about serving than protection. So that's why you can carry on and be more compassionate and carry on way. So I've been on 20 years, and I'm going to still be a compassionate cop, and I'm going to keep being that person to be more understanding. And if more cops open their mind to that, we will have a better relationship.
Or with each other. Grace. And hopefully, as we close, because one thing the book does, it kind of sheds light on everybody, because sometimes this conversation is always about the community and the police. It never gets to a point where it begins to talk about the police and the police. And so that's a whole nother topic, and hopefully it also gives us a chance to get deep into that, and how trauma informs the kind of relationships we have inside the department, right? And how we treat each other, and how we talk to each other, right? All of that is a part of this trauma experience, and I think it just makes us better people, and it helps us police better. It helps us do everything we need to do in the city better, And if we raise better children, obviously, we'll looking forward to having less of issues that we have, because we're not passing that. And this saying that's going on the internet all the time that we have, that says that we're gonna break the curse or the cycle, all that stuff they're talking about. I thought it was funny for a minute, but when I read this book, it makes me understand clearly what that means, like break the cycle of trauma. And it's just not a saying, it's actually some practices that you should do to actually break that cycle of trauma. And you don't have to beat your kids in order to discipline them, or you it's okay if they run around and even though the book says spare the rod, spoil the child, brother, but that's right, brother. My mother said, if you hurt yourself, I'm gonna kill you. So it's gonna hurt me more. So we gonna get through it, y'all. I appreciate y'all for coming out. Hopefully you read this book. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for putting this together. Thank you, Dr. Brown.
I want to thank all the panelists. This is awesome. Again, we approaching this not necessarily as experts, but as vulnerable people. And I think one thing that they talk about in leadership is you don't believe that you can be vulnerable. And anytime you're in a relationship, right, especially one of love, and that's what we're trying to establish, you have to bring some vulnerability. And so I just thank you guys for being vulnerable. I thank you for saying, I'm going to really engage in some equity work. I might check off that diversity checklist, but I'm going to work on some real equity so I can understand who I serve. And then it's going to ultimately be an inclusive society where all individuals are respected, represented, loved, understood, and served. And so I thank you. And I also want to acknowledge our police chief, Lee Douglas. Let's give him a round of applause for being here. And you're going to be on the panel next, so get ready, get ready. One of the things about this book, and I know the mayor is looking at me, but two things. You have to read it slowly because you have to engage in a body practice. So I want us to close off this with a body practice that's actually in the book. And one of the things it's talking about is humming and things like that. And so we're just going to ask you to engage for 2 minutes as we listen to Morehouse College help us engage in a body practice that you're going to see as you're reading. And then after this, we're going to do some more celebrating and eating and enjoying ourselves because this is a celebration. Let's clap it up for everybody here. This is a celebration.